A peasant from Siberia walked into the private world of the Romanovs, and somehow his name became tangled with the death of an empire. Grigori Rasputin had no crown, no army, no noble blood worth mentioning, and yet, inside the gilded halls of imperial Russia, this wandering holy man gained access to the most guarded family in the country. Outside, the empire was shaking. Inside, a dynasty was listening to a man many believed should never have been there. The question is not simply whether Rasputin was a saint, a fraud, or something in between. The deeper question is more unsettling. How did one obscure mystic become so closely linked to the fall of a 300-year dynasty? To understand that, we have to move carefully, not through the cartoon version of Rasputin, the wild-eyed villain, the supernatural puppet master, the man of endless rumors, but through the quieter, stranger world that allowed him to matter at all. Because Rasputin did not enter a healthy empire and poison it from within. He entered a palace already full of fear. Picture the Winter Palace not as a fairy tale setting, but as a sealed chamber at the edge of a storm. There are uniforms, icons, polished floors, and the rituals of absolute power. But behind the ceremony is a family under pressure, a government losing trust, and a secret so painful that almost no one outside the inner circle is allowed to fully understand it. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. For now, Rasputin is only arriving. The doors have opened, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, Russia is already beginning to crack. Chapter 2. An empire already cracking. Long before Rasputin became a name whispered in drawing rooms and printed in scandal sheets, the Romanov dynasty was already standing on weakened ground. This is one of the first misunderstandings in the story. It is tempting to imagine imperial Russia as a strong, ancient structure brought down by one strange man from Siberia, as if Rasputin arrived with muddy boots and somehow kicked loose the foundations of a 300-year monarchy. But history is rarely that tidy. Empires do not usually collapse because of one person. They collapse when too many pressures are ignored for too long. And then one person, one rumor, one disaster becomes the face of everything that has gone wrong. Russia, at the beginning of the 20th century, was enormous, proud, and deeply uneasy. It stretched across continents, ruled by a Tsar who still claimed authority not from parliament, not from public consent, but from God. The Romanovs sat at the top of a sacred political order, surrounded by ceremony and old language, while beneath them millions lived with hardship that no golden procession could disguise. For much of the population, the empire was not a world of chandeliers and court uniforms. It was hunger, debt, poor land, low wages, dangerous factories, and officials who often felt distant or untouchable. Industrial cities had grown quickly, but the political system had not grown with them. Workers crowded into urban spaces where resentment could gather and spread. Peasants remembered promises of reform, but often felt trapped by poverty. Students, radicals, intellectuals, and revolutionaries argued over what kind of Russia should replace the old one, if the old one could not be forced to change. And the monarchy did change, but reluctantly, and often only under pressure. That reluctance mattered. It created a pattern that would haunt Nicholas II's reign. Reform came late, distrust came early, and every concession seemed to satisfy almost no one. To conservatives, any reform looked like weakness. To liberals and revolutionaries, it looked like too little. To ordinary people, it often looked like something decided somewhere far away by men who had never stood in a breadline, waited for wages, or watched a son disappear into the army. The Romanovs were not blind to all of this. That would be too simple. They knew Russia was troubled. They knew there were strikes, protests, secret police files, political pamphlets, and dangerous conversations in cafes, factories, and universities. But knowing that unrest exists is not the same as understanding what it means. From inside the imperial world, rebellion could look like ingratitude, foreign contamination, or the work of wicked agitators. Some of it was revolutionary agitation, yes, but much of it was also ordinary frustration, made sharper by a system that gave people few peaceful ways to be heard. This is where the distance between palace and country becomes more than a symbol. It becomes a political danger. Autocracy depends on belief, not just fear, not just police power, belief. People must believe that the ruler is legitimate, that suffering has meaning, that the state is still capable of protecting them, or at least that no better alternative exists. Once that belief begins to thin, the rituals of power can start to look hollow. The uniforms remain, the titles remain, the prayers are still spoken, but something invisible has shifted. By the time Rasputin entered the imperial family's orbit, the Romanovs were already facing that invisible shift. There had been unrest in the cities. There had been revolutionary movements growing in confidence and organization. There had been anger over poverty, over political repression, over the stubborn survival of a system that seemed older than the century it was trying to govern. The empire was modernizing in pieces: railways, factories, newspapers, political ideas, while its highest authority remained tied to a vision of sacred kingship that left little room for compromise. That contradiction was dangerous because it made every crisis personal. If the Tsar ruled by divine duty, then criticism of the government could feel like criticism of God's chosen order. If the ruler was the father of the nation, then the nation's suffering became a kind of family accusation. And if the imperial family withdrew into privacy, faith, and court ritual, then the public imagination was free to fill the silence with suspicion. Rasputin would later become useful to that suspicion. He gave people a figure to point at, a dirty hand on a clean throne, a peasant intruder in a sacred palace, a convenient explanation for decisions that seemed irrational, ministers who came and went too quickly, and a monarchy that appeared increasingly detached from reality. But the anger attached to Rasputin did not begin with him. He absorbed it. He concentrated it. In that sense, his power as a symbol may have been greater than his power as a man. The deeper tragedy is that the Romanovs lived inside an empire that needed political imagination, and they answered too often with loyalty, ceremony, and suspicion. They believed in endurance. They believed in sacred obligation. They believed that Russia could survive storms because it had survived storms before. But the storms were changing. The old empire was not merely being challenged by a handful of radicals hiding in back rooms. It was being strained by the modern world itself. Mass politics, industrial labor, public opinion, newspapers, war, bureaucracy, and the growing expectation that ordinary people had some claim on the future of their country. The Romanovs still possessed immense authority, but authority is not the same as trust. And trust, once it begins to drain away, is difficult to command back into existence. So when Rasputin finally appears near the center of power, He does not arrive as the sole cause of disaster. He arrives as a test, a strange, unsettling test of how weak the system had become. A confident monarchy might have dismissed him. A politically secure court might have contained the scandal. A family not trapped by fear might have kept him at a distance. But Russia was not secure. The palace was not calm. And the dynasty, though still glittering from the outside, had already begun to fracture within. Chapter 3. The Tsar who believed in sacred duty. Nicholas II did not come to the throne as a man hungry to remake Russia. That matters. Some rulers are remembered for their ambition, for the force with which they bend institutions around their own will. Nicholas was not that kind of monarch. He inherited power more than he seized it. He stepped into a role shaped by centuries of ritual, theology, family expectation, and political habit. To him, the throne was not simply an office. It was a burden handed down by God. This belief can sound distant now, almost theatrical, but for Nicholas, it was deeply personal. He had been raised to understand autocracy as sacred duty. The Tsar was not merely a political leader who could negotiate his authority like a minister in a cabinet. He was the guardian of Russia's spiritual and national order. To give away too much power was not just a tactical mistake. It could feel like a betrayal of the very purpose for which he had been born. And here we begin to see the tragedy of Nicholas more clearly. He was not, in private, a monster. He could be affectionate, sincere, devoted to his family, and capable of real tenderness. Those qualities make him more human, but they do not make him more suited to rule a country in crisis. A man can be loving at the breakfast table and still disastrous on the throne. History is full of private virtues that did not become public wisdom. Nicholas's weakness was not that he believed in nothing. It was almost the opposite. He believed in certain things so firmly that he struggled to see when they were failing in practice. He believed in the dynasty. He believed in order. He believed in obedience, faith, and continuity. He believed Russia needed a father, not a debate society. There is a bleak little irony in that. At the very moment Russia was becoming harder for one man to govern, Nicholas held more tightly to the idea that one man must govern it. This did not mean he was always decisive. Sacred conviction and political confidence are not the same thing. Nicholas often appeared hesitant, uncomfortable with confrontation, and dependent on the counsel of those around him. He could resist broad constitutional change in principle, yet still waver in the daily mechanics of government. He could insist on autocratic authority, yet seem overwhelmed by the practical demands of using it. That combination was especially dangerous. A strong autocrat may frighten people. A weak autocrat confuses them. Ministers cannot be sure how long they will last. Reformers cannot know whether concessions are genuine or temporary. Conservatives cannot decide whether the ruler will defend them firmly enough. The public sees not a sacred figure above politics, but a man pulled between pressures, retreating into family life and religious certainty, while the machinery of state grows louder and more unstable. Nicholas's world was also narrow, not because he was incapable of thought, but because the courtly environment around him filtered reality. Information reached the palace through layers of rank, loyalty, fear, and etiquette. Bad news could be softened. Criticism could be interpreted as disloyalty. Popular anger could be reduced to the work of agitators. Inside such a system, even an honest man could become dangerously misinformed. This is one reason Rasputin's later presence became so corrosive. The problem was not only that a peasant mystic gained access to the imperial family. The problem was that the imperial family already existed in a world where private trust could outweigh public accountability. Personal impressions mattered too much. Loyalty mattered too much. Spiritual reassurance could become a kind of political credential. Nicholas wanted to be a good Tsar. That may be one of the saddest facts about him. He did not set out to ruin his dynasty. He did not imagine himself as the last Romanov ruler, standing near the edge of a collapsing world. He imagined himself as a faithful custodian of an ancient inheritance. But inheritance can become a trap. The Romanov system required qualities Nicholas did not possess in sufficient measure: flexibility, political imagination, a willingness to share authority before force made sharing irrelevant, and the emotional distance to separate family anguish from state decision-making. He had faith, but faith alone could not run an empire of workers, peasants, soldiers, nobles, national minorities, revolutionaries, bureaucrats, and hungry cities. What people often miss is that Nicholas's sincerity made the crisis harder, not easier. A purely cynical ruler might bargain sooner. A purely pragmatic ruler might sacrifice old doctrines to preserve the state. Nicholas's attachment to sacred duty made compromise feel morally suspect. He was not simply defending power for comfort. He believed he was defending an order higher than himself. And so, as Russia's pressures increased, Nicholas did what many frightened institutions do. He reached backward to tradition, backward to divine authority, backward to the family circle, where love still felt certain when politics did not. That family circle will soon become the most important private chamber in the empire, because beside Nicholas stood Alexandra Feodorovna, isolated, devout, mistrusted, and fiercely protective of the people she loved. And if Nicholas believed the throne was sacred duty, Alexandra would come to believe that one strange man had been sent to protect the future of that throne itself. Chapter 4. The Isolated Empress. Alexandra Feodorovna entered Russian history as an empress. But much of her life inside the palace feels less like triumph than enclosure. She had crossed into a world that never fully accepted her. Born a German princess, married into the Romanov dynasty, converted to Russian Orthodoxy, and crowned beside Nicholas II, Alexandra occupied one of the most visible positions in Europe. Yet visibility is not the same as belonging. At court, she was watched, judged, and often disliked. Her reserve was mistaken for arrogance. Her seriousness made her seem cold. Her discomfort with the glittering rituals of aristocratic society only deepened the suspicion that she did not understand Russia, or worse, did not love it. The truth was more complicated and more human. Alexandra was intensely devoted to her family. She was religious in a way that was not merely decorative. Faith was not something she wore for ceremony. It shaped her sense of suffering, motherhood, loyalty, and duty. She did not move easily through the social theater of court life, where charm could be as valuable as wisdom and gossip traveled faster than policy. She preferred the protected world of husband, children, prayer, and private feeling. That preference might have been harmless in another life. In the life she had, it became politically dangerous. An empress in an autocracy was never only a wife and mother. Every friendship, every absence, every whispered influence could become a matter of state. When Alexandra withdrew from court society, she did not simply protect herself from people she distrusted. She also surrendered the informal networks that might have softened hostility toward her. The court did not stop talking because she kept away. It talked more. And in those conversations, Alexandra became easy to misunderstand. Some saw her as proud. Some saw her as foreign. Some saw her as fanatical. Some saw her as a woman who had too much influence over a husband already considered politically uncertain. What makes this so destructive is that suspicion did not require much evidence to grow. It only needed distance, secrecy, and an atmosphere where people already believed the monarchy was losing touch with reality. Alexandra's loneliness was not a footnote. It helped shape the path by which Rasputin entered the imperial family's deepest trust, because loneliness changes how certainty sounds. To a person surrounded by friendly voices, a confident spiritual advisor may seem interesting, perhaps even comforting. To a person who feels hated, isolated, and responsible for a child's suffering, certainty can feel like rescue. Rasputin did not have to convince an entire court. He had to become meaningful inside one small, frightened family circle. Alexandra's emotional world made that possible. This does not mean she was foolish in some simple way. That interpretation is too easy, and frankly, too smug. Alexandra lived under pressures most people around her could not see clearly. She was the mother of the heir to the throne. She carried the private terror of his illness. She believed deeply in divine providence. She distrusted a court that, in her eyes, was shallow, cruel, and politically unreliable. When someone appeared who seemed loyal, prayerful, and mysteriously effective in moments of family crisis, she did not see a scandal waiting to happen. She saw help. The tragedy is that her private measure of trust was completely different from the public consequences of that trust. Alexandra judged Rasputin through the lens of personal loyalty and spiritual comfort. The court judged him through rank, rumor, class, and reputation. The public eventually judged him through scandal. These judgments did not meet in the middle. They collided. Inside the palace, Rasputin could be defended as a holy man, a humble pilgrim, perhaps a flawed but God-touched figure whose prayers mattered. Outside the palace, he could look like proof that the imperial family had lost all sense. The same access that reassured Alexandra outraged everyone else. The more fiercely she defended him, the more suspicious he became. The more suspicious he became, the more she interpreted attacks on him as attacks on her family, her faith, and her suffering child. It was a closed circle, and it tightened with every rumor. Here, the story becomes less about whether Alexandra was under Rasputin's spell, a phrase that belongs more to melodrama than careful history. It is more useful to say that she became emotionally dependent on what he represented. He represented hope when medicine failed. He represented loyalty when court society seemed poisonous. He represented divine attention in a household haunted by fear. That distinction matters. A spell suggests fantasy. Dependence suggests something more believable, and in some ways, more tragic. Alexandra did not need to be hypnotized to make disastrous judgments. She only needed to be afraid, isolated, devout, and convinced that the welfare of her son outweighed the opinions of people she already distrusted. In that state of mind, criticism could not easily penetrate. It arrived already discredited, and so, as the empire outside grew louder and more restless, the Empress moved deeper into a private world where faith and family pain became inseparable. She did not see herself as weakening the monarchy. She believed she was protecting its future. But the future of the dynasty depended on a boy whose illness had to remain hidden. And once we understand that secret, Rasputin's rise begins to look less like an absurdity and more like the terrible logic of desperation. Chapter 5. The Secret Illness of the Heir. At the center of the Romanov family was a secret small enough to fit inside a nursery and large enough to distort the politics of an empire. The secret was Alexei. The long-awaited son of Nicholas and Alexandra was not simply a beloved child. He was the heir to the Russian throne, the future of the dynasty made flesh. In a monarchy built on succession, his birth should have brought relief. After years of daughters, after anxiety over the imperial line, Russia finally had a Tsarevich. But almost from the beginning, joy came with terror. Alexei had hemophilia, a condition that prevented his blood from clotting properly. A bruise, a fall, a minor injury, things most families would treat with concern and then forget, could become dangerous. Pain could arrive suddenly and stay. Internal bleeding could turn an ordinary childhood accident into a crisis. For his parents, every movement carried an invisible risk. This illness must be understood not only medically, but emotionally and politically. For Alexandra, it was a private agony sharpened by guilt. Hemophilia passed through royal bloodlines, and in the Romanov household, the disease was not just a diagnosis. It was a shadow over motherhood, inheritance, and divine purpose. The child who represented the dynasty's future was fragile in a way that could not be announced openly without shaking confidence in that future. So the family concealed it. That secrecy was understandable. It was also disastrous. A modern public might expect transparency about the health of a future ruler. But the Romanovs lived inside a political culture where weakness at the top could feel dangerous. The heir was supposed to symbolize continuity. To admit that he might not survive childhood, or might never be physically secure, would have invited fear, speculation, and political calculation. Ministers, nobles, foreign courts, revolutionaries, everyone would have interpreted the news through their own ambitions and anxieties. So the truth stayed behind palace doors. But secrets do not disappear simply because they are protected. They create rooms where outsiders cannot see, and in those rooms, other explanations grow. When decisions seem strange, when certain people gain unusual access, when the imperial family behaves defensively, those who do not know the hidden cause begin to invent one. The secrecy around Alexei's illness did not merely hide a medical condition. It made the monarchy harder to understand. And into that hidden space came Rasputin. Not at first as a political actor, not as the villain of later legend. He entered through pain, fear, and the failure of ordinary remedies. Doctors could not reliably protect Alexei. Court physicians might offer treatment, restraint, caution, and clinical language, but they could not give the one thing the parents wanted most: certainty. In those moments, medicine must have felt both necessary and helpless. Rasputin offered something different. He offered prayer, calm, presence, a sense that suffering was not random. When Alexei was in crisis, Rasputin seemed, at least to Nicholas and especially to Alexandra, able to help. The evidence around specific episodes can be difficult to untangle, and later retellings often made the story more dramatic than the record can comfortably support. What matters historically is not whether every miracle happened exactly as legend describes. What matters is that the imperial parents believed he could bring relief when others could not. Belief in a household like this became power. This is one of the most important details in the entire Rasputin story. His influence was not built first on policy, ideology, or formal rank. It was built on access to parental desperation. Alexandra did not trust him because he had a theory of government. She trusted him because, in her eyes, he had been present when her son's life seemed to hang in the balance. Once a person is associated with the survival of your child, ordinary standards of judgment can change. From the outside, this looked irrational. From the inside, it had its own terrible logic. Imagine the Empress watching Alexei suffer, knowing that his pain was also the dynasty's vulnerability. Imagine the fear of one wrong fall, one careless movement, one crisis that could not be reversed. Imagine being surrounded by courtiers who judged you, ministers who disappointed you, doctors who could not promise safety, and a public that could never be told the full truth. Then imagine a rough, unsettling, deeply unconventional holy man who speaks as if God is near, who tells you not to despair, and whose arrival seems to coincide with improvement. A historian does not need to endorse the miracle to understand the dependence. Rasputin's role grew because the family's need was not ordinary. It was intimate, recurring, and hidden. Each crisis renewed the bond. Each recovery, however medically explainable it may have been, strengthened Alexandra's conviction. And because the illness itself remained secret, outsiders saw only the result. Rasputin, coming and going, treated with astonishing tolerance, defended against accusations that would have ruined most men at court. This is why Alexei's hemophilia was not a side story. It was the locked door behind the scandal. Without the heir's illness, Rasputin may have remained one more religious wanderer among many in a society fascinated by spiritual seekers, mystics, and holy men. He might have attracted attention, caused gossip, even impressed aristocratic patrons for a time. But he would not have held the same emotional leverage over the imperial family. The suffering child gave him a place no title could have given him, and yet, the same secret that explained his presence also made that presence politically poisonous. The court could not be told, "We tolerate him because we believe he helps the heir survive." The public could not be told, "The future Tsar is dangerously ill, and his mother clings to the man she believes can calm the crisis." So the silence remained. In that silence, Rasputin became whatever people feared most: seducer, manipulator, spy, fraud, prophet, peasant avenger, demon at the gates of monarchy. The truth was less theatrical, but more devastating. A frightened family made private choices for reasons they could not publicly defend. A fragile child became the center of a secret emotional government. And an empire already suspicious of its rulers watched a mysterious outsider draw closer and closer to the throne. The Romanovs were trying to protect Alexei. In doing so, they helped create the conditions in which Rasputin could become indispensable. Chapter 6: The Siberian Pilgrim. Rasputin did not begin as a palace scandal. He began far from the polished world that would later fear him. In rural Siberia, in a village where life moved according to seasons, labor, hunger, weather, and faith. To understand why he unsettled the Russian elite so deeply, we have to remember where he came from. He was not merely an outsider to the court. He seemed to belong to another Russia altogether, rougher, poorer, less mannered, less interested in the codes by which aristocrats recognized one another. That difference became part of his power. Grigori Rasputin was born into a peasant world where religion was not confined to cathedrals or state ceremonies. Faith could be physical, emotional, superstitious, communal, frightening, comforting, sometimes all at once. In villages and on pilgrimage roads, Russia had long made room for holy wanderers, spiritual seekers, eccentrics, healers, and men who lived on the edge of respectable society. Some were sincere, some were unstable, some were frauds, some were probably a mixture, which is usually the more difficult category. Rasputin belongs in that difficult category. The later legend wants him to be simple, either a saintly peasant with healing gifts, or a depraved manipulator who fooled an empire. But the record resists that neatness. He was charismatic, certainly. He made powerful impressions on people. He could speak with unusual intensity. He seemed to understand how to enter the emotional life of those who needed comfort, especially those who felt trapped by conventional religion or court etiquette. At the same time, accusations of drunkenness, sexual misconduct, and manipulation followed him long before his name became politically explosive. The problem is that Rasputin's life comes to us through layers of fascination and hostility. People who loved him had reasons to polish him into a holy man. People who hated him had reasons to make him monstrous. Journalists had reasons to make him sell newspapers. Politicians had reasons to make him symbolize decay. Aristocrats had reasons to exaggerate the horror of a peasant crossing social boundaries they considered sacred. Somewhere behind all of that was a real man, but he is not always easy to separate from the smoke around him. What we can say with more confidence is that Rasputin learned how to inhabit ambiguity. He was not a priest. That is important. He had no official religious office that should have given him authority inside the imperial family. He was a wandering religious figure, a pilgrim, a starets in the loose popular sense people sometimes used for a spiritual elder, though the term could imply more legitimacy than he formally possessed. His authority came not from institution, but from presence. He did not need a title if people believed he had access to something deeper than titles. This made him both compelling and dangerous. Institutional religion has rules. Court society has ranks. Bureaucracy has documents. Rasputin moved through a more fluid world, where reputation mattered more than credentials, where a whispered story of spiritual insight could open doors that official channels kept closed. To some members of the educated elite, this was embarrassing. To others, it was fascinating. Russia's upper classes could mock peasant mysticism in public and still be drawn to it in private, especially in an age when spiritual restlessness was fashionable, and many people felt that ordinary religion had grown too formal, too cold, too entangled with power. Rasputin arrived at the edge of that hunger. He had the advantage of seeming unmanufactured. His manners were not polished. His speech could be direct. His appearance did not flatter aristocratic expectations. Later descriptions often dwell on his eyes, his smell, his hair, his hands, his unsettling closeness. Some of this is observation. Some of it is literary embroidery. But the repetition tells us something. People experienced him physically. He did not blend into a room. He disturbed it. And disturbance can be mistaken for depth. That does not mean he was only performing. Rasputin may well have believed in his own spiritual calling. Many effective manipulators believe part of their own story, and many sincere people learn to enjoy influence. Human beings do not divide cleanly into fraud and believer. Rasputin seems to have existed in the uncomfortable space between spiritual intensity and appetite, between compassion and self-importance, between prayer and scandal. That mixture made him hard to dismiss and hard to defend. It also made him perfectly suited to a court that was already confused about what kind of salvation it needed. To Alexandra, and eventually to the private world of the imperial family, Rasputin's peasant origins could be read as proof of authenticity. He was not another polished courtier. He did not belong to the aristocratic circles she distrusted. He seemed closer to the suffering Russian people, closer to simple faith, closer perhaps to the kind of holiness that does not arrive wearing medals and speaking French in drawing rooms. To his enemies, the same qualities meant degradation. A peasant in the palace was not picturesque to them. It was an insult. Rasputin's presence seemed to invert the social order. He touched the sacred center of monarchy without passing through the proper gates. He sat near people who should have been unreachable. He was listened to by those who ignored ministers. He became, in the aristocratic imagination, not merely a bad influence, but a living violation of hierarchy. This is one reason the Rasputin story became so violent in its symbolism. He was not only accused of corrupt behavior, he was accused of being out of place, and being out of place, in a rigid society, can look like a crime before any crime has been proven. The Siberian Pilgrim carried many meanings before he ever offered advice about politics. To seekers, he could be a man of God. To skeptics, a charlatan. To women and men drawn to his intensity, a spiritual force. To enemies of the monarchy, a gift. To defenders of the old order, a humiliation. To the imperial family, eventually, a possible instrument of divine mercy. Those meanings did not cancel one another. They accumulated. By the time Rasputin reached the Romanovs, he was already surrounded by stories. Some may have been true. Some were likely inflated. Some were probably invented by people who needed him to be worse, or better, than any ordinary man could be. But his greatest advantage was not purity, and it was not even wickedness. It was uncertainty. No one could fully agree on what he was, and in a nervous empire, uncertainty can become magnetic. Chapter 7. The First Miracle. The first real turning point in Rasputin's story did not happen in a council chamber. It happened beside a sick child. That is why the usual image of Rasputin as a political conspirator, whispering into the machinery of empire, begins too late. His influence did not start with appointments, ministers, or national policy. It began in the private terror of parents who had learned that the future of their dynasty could bleed from a small injury. Alexei's hemophilia created a world of emergencies. A bruise might become a crisis. A fall might become a vigil. Rooms that should have held the ordinary sounds of childhood instead became places of watchfulness, prayer, and whispered medical uncertainty. The Romanovs had doctors, yes. They had access to the best help the imperial household could summon. But medicine at the time had limits, and hemophilia was a cruel teacher of those limits. Then came Rasputin. The stories of his early interventions have been told so often that they can feel almost like legend before we even examine them. According to later accounts, Rasputin was called upon during moments when Alexei was suffering, and somehow the boy's condition seemed to improve. Sometimes the explanation given is prayer, sometimes calm. Sometimes the idea that Rasputin's presence reduced panic around the child. Some historians have also suggested that his advice may have helped indirectly if it discouraged treatments that could worsen bleeding, though the evidence around specific episodes must be handled carefully. The important point is not that we can prove a supernatural cure. We cannot. The important point is that Nicholas and Alexandra came to believe that Rasputin's prayers mattered. And in history, belief often has consequences as real as fact. For Alexandra especially, these moments were not abstract. They were not theological puzzles to be debated by comfortable people after dinner. They were nights of maternal fear. Her son was in pain. The heir was in danger. Doctors could not guarantee his safety. In that atmosphere, if Rasputin appeared, prayed, spoke with confidence, and the crisis passed. The event did not need to be scientifically explained to become emotionally decisive. A parent does not experience relief like a historian footnoting a document. A parent remembers who was there when the child survived. This is where Rasputin crossed an invisible border. Before, he could be seen as a wandering holy man with unusual access to aristocratic circles. After these episodes, he became something more intimate. He became associated with Alexei's life, and that association gave him a kind of protection almost impossible for outsiders to understand. It also gave Alexandra a reason to forgive what others considered unforgivable. If Rasputin drank, if rumors followed him, if churchmen complained, if courtiers were disgusted, all of that could be weighed against one unbearable question. What if he truly helped Alexei? What if God worked through imperfect instruments? Religious history is full of flawed men claimed as vessels of grace. Alexandra's faith allowed room for that possibility. Her fear made it urgent. Nicholas's position was more restrained, but no less consequential. He may not have felt Rasputin's presence with Alexandra's intensity, yet he tolerated him. That tolerance mattered. In an autocracy, access to the family was never merely personal. If the Tsar allowed someone to remain near the imperial household, despite scandal, people noticed. They always noticed. Still, from inside the family, the logic was painfully simple. Rasputin had been present during crises. Alexei had recovered. Alexandra believed. Nicholas loved Alexandra and feared for his son. The court could complain, but the court did not sit through every private hour of dread. Ministers could warn, but ministers did not carry the heir's illness in their hearts. And because the illness remained secret, the public saw only the strange result. A peasant pilgrim was being treated with remarkable patience by the most powerful family in Russia. He came and went. He received attention. He survived accusations that would have destroyed another man's position. People searched for explanations, and in the absence of the real one, darker explanations were ready. This is one reason the first miracle matters, even if the miracle itself remains uncertain. It created a private truth that could not be translated into public language. Inside the palace, Rasputin was linked to hope. Outside the palace, he was linked to disgrace. Both views grew stronger because neither side could fully reach the other. The Romanovs could not say what they most needed to say. They could not tell Russia, "This man stays because our son may die, and because we believe his prayers help keep despair away." So they said less. They denied, deflected, protected, endured. And silence did what silence often does in politics. It became evidence against them. Over time, the memory of those early crises hardened into trust. Alexandra did not merely think Rasputin had once been useful. She began to see him as providential, a man sent into their lives for a reason. That interpretation changed everything. A doctor could be replaced. A minister could be dismissed. A courtier could be ignored. But a providential man could not be treated like ordinary company. This was the moment Rasputin's ambiguity became power. His gift did not have to be proven to outsiders, because the people who mattered most had already accepted it. And once the Empress believed that her son's survival might be tied to this unsettling pilgrim, no scandal could remain only a scandal. Every attack on Rasputin could be felt as a threat to Alexei. The palace doors had opened because of suffering. Now they would stay open because of fear. Chapter 8. Faith becomes dependence. At first, Rasputin's place in the Romanov household could be explained by crisis. A child was ill. A mother was afraid. A father, already burdened by the throne, watched his family suffer in a way no public ceremony could soften. In those early moments, Rasputin was not yet the symbol he would become. He was a source of comfort in a private emergency. But comfort, repeated often enough, can become authority. This is where the story begins to narrow. The empire remains vast, noisy, and restless outside the palace. But inside the imperial family, trust is becoming concentrated in one man. Not because Rasputin held an office. Not because he had earned the confidence of the government. Not because the church had formally declared him a guide above reproach. His authority grew through a more intimate route. The emotional memory of relief. Alexandra's trust in him deepened because she believed she had seen the evidence with her own eyes. When Alexei suffered and Rasputin's prayers seemed to bring calm, she did not experience that as coincidence. She experienced it as grace. And once a person interprets a relationship as divinely arranged, ordinary warnings lose much of their force. This is not unique to Alexandra. It is a human pattern. When someone appears during our worst fear and seems to help us survive it, we do not judge them as strangers do. We judge them through gratitude. We protect the story in which they saved us. Because to question that story is to reopen the terror that came before it. For Alexandra, Rasputin was not simply a man with a questionable reputation. He was bound to the one subject on which she could not be detached: her son. Every accusation against him had to pass through that emotional gate. Was he vulgar? Perhaps. Did he drink? Possibly. Were there rumors? Too many to ignore. But had he helped Alexei? In her mind, yes. And that answer outweighed almost everything else. Nicholas allowed this dependence to continue, partly because he too feared for the boy, and partly because he loved Alexandra. His tolerance was not always the same as her conviction. Yet in practice, the difference mattered less than it might seem. A ruler who personally doubts but publicly permits can still create the same result as a ruler who fully believes. Rasputin remained close enough to matter, and that was enough. The strange thing about dependence is that it often disguises itself as loyalty. Alexandra believed she was being loyal to God, to her child, to the dynasty, and to the man she thought had been sent to help them. Nicholas believed, or at least hoped, that protecting his wife's faith in Rasputin was part of protecting the family. But the monarchy was not a private household. It could not absorb personal loyalties without political consequences. This is the hinge of the tragedy. The Romanovs treated Rasputin as an intimate matter. Russia increasingly saw him as a public scandal. The gap between those two realities widened until almost no explanation could cross it. Inside the palace, Rasputin's roughness could be excused as simplicity. His disregard for manners could be interpreted as spiritual honesty. His peasant background could make him seem closer to authentic Russia than the polished aristocrats Alexandra distrusted. His flaws could be folded into a religious understanding that God sometimes worked through imperfect vessels. Outside the palace, the same traits told a different story. To nobles, he looked like contamination. To ministers, he looked like interference. To clergy who distrusted him, he looked like a dangerous embarrassment. To ordinary Russians hearing rumors secondhand, he became proof that something diseased had entered the monarchy's heart. A man who might have been tolerated as a provincial eccentric became intolerable when people believed he had the ear of the Empress. The evidence for his influence in these years must be handled with care. Rasputin was not secretly ruling Russia from behind a curtain. That image belongs more to propaganda and later myth than to sober analysis. But influence does not need to be absolute to be damaging. Even partial influence can be politically explosive if it appears illegitimate, unaccountable, and hidden. And Rasputin's influence appeared all three. He could send recommendations, he could speak privately, he could encourage Alexandra in her judgments, he could help shape her confidence or suspicion. He did not need to draft laws to matter. In a court where access was power, where the Empress's trust affected the Tsar's household, and where secrecy already made people uneasy, his presence became a political fact even when his actual reach was exaggerated. This distinction is important. Rasputin's enemies often made him larger than life because that served their argument. If Rasputin was the monster behind the throne, then the monarchy's failure had a name and a face. It was easier to blame a holy man with dirty hands than to admit that autocracy itself was exhausted, that war was looming, that social trust was collapsing, and that the imperial family had become dangerously isolated. But Alexandra also made him larger than life in a different way. By investing him with providential meaning, she raised him above ordinary criticism. She did not have to claim he was perfect. She only had to believe he was necessary. And necessary people are hard to remove. So dependence hardened into defense. Defense hardened into defiance. The more the court warned against Rasputin, the more Alexandra suspected the court. The more Alexandra protected him, the more the court believed the worst. Each side confirmed the other's fears with almost mechanical precision. Rasputin benefited from this, whether by calculation, instinct, or both. He understood that his safest place was not in the affection of society, but in the trust of the imperial family. He did not need everyone to believe in him. He needed the right people to believe enough. And they did. By the time the rumors grew louder, Rasputin was no longer simply a visitor summoned during illness. He had become part of the Romanovs' emotional architecture. Not a foundation exactly, but a hidden support beam placed where no one outside could see it, and where removing it felt, to Alexandra, like inviting collapse. The palace had made room for him. Now Russia would begin to notice how much room he seemed to occupy. Chapter 9. Scandal at the Gates. By the time Rasputin became famous, it was no longer possible to speak about him plainly. He had become a rumor wearing a human body. This is the difficulty with his story. The closer he came to the imperial family, the harder it became to separate fact from performance, testimony from gossip, sincere alarm from political usefulness. Rasputin did not merely live a scandalous life in the ordinary sense. He entered a world that needed scandal, a court already bored, anxious, competitive, and resentful, a press hungry for symbols, enemies of the monarchy eager for proof that the old order was rotten. And Rasputin gave them material. He was accused of drunkenness, sexual misconduct, manipulation, and corruption. Some allegations were likely exaggerated. Some were shaped by class disgust. Some were probably rooted in real behavior that even sympathetic observers could not easily excuse. The problem is not that every rumor was true. The problem is that enough seemed believable. That is what made him politically lethal. In private, the imperial family could insist that he was a man of prayer, misunderstood by malicious people. But outside that private circle, Rasputin's reputation darkened with every story. He was said to stagger through restaurants, boast of his access, accept favors, involve himself in petitions, and surround himself with people hoping to use his name. The details vary in reliability, and many later versions were sharpened for drama. Still, the general impression became impossible to contain. The monarchy's inner world had allowed a man of deeply questionable reputation too close to power. Perception did not wait for proof. In politics, that can be fatal. A government may survive private foolishness if the public never sees it. It may survive scandal if trust is strong enough to absorb the shock. But the Romanov regime had little trust to spare. Every rumor about Rasputin landed on ground already prepared by poverty, repression, elite frustration, and the sense that Nicholas and Alexandra were sealed off from reality. So Rasputin's sins, real or imagined, became larger than himself. To his enemies, he was not merely a drunk. He was the drunkenness of autocracy made visible. Not merely a seducer, but the seduction of the throne by corruption. Not merely a manipulator, but proof that sacred monarchy had become ridiculous. The man became metaphor, and metaphor is often harder to kill than fact. There was also a social humiliation in the scandal that is easy to underestimate. Rasputin was a peasant. He did not behave like a courtier. He did not flatter the aristocracy by pretending to belong to its rules. His rough manners, his physical familiarity, his religious language, his disregard for polite boundaries, all of it offended people who believed proximity to the royal family should be guarded by birth, education, and rank. Some of their outrage may have been moral. Some of it was certainly about class. Had Rasputin been a polished nobleman with the same influence, the scandal would still have been serious. But it would have felt different. He would have been one of their own, perhaps a disgrace, but a recognizable disgrace. Rasputin was worse because he suggested that the palace no longer knew how to defend its own hierarchy. For elites built on hierarchy, that was not a small insult. It was an omen. The church, too, could not easily ignore him. Rasputin's religious persona made his alleged behavior more offensive. A corrupt official is one thing. A corrupt holy man is another. When someone claims spiritual authority, or allows others to believe he possesses it, ordinary vice becomes sacrilege in the public imagination. Even if some charges were inflated, the contrast between piety and scandal gave his enemies endless ammunition, and he seemed, again and again, to survive. This survival damaged the monarchy more than any single accusation. Each time Rasputin was criticized and remained near the family, the public lesson appeared to be that normal standards did not apply. Ministers might object, clergy might warn, relatives might complain, society might rage. Still, the strange man from Siberia endured. That endurance made the imperial couple look not merciful, but captive. Here we have to be careful. There is no need to accept the most lurid stories about Rasputin to understand the damage. The wilder legends, the superhuman appetite, the demonic control, the near-magical corruption, often reveal more about the fears of the people telling them than about the man himself. Rasputin became a screen onto which Russia projected anxiety about sex, class, religion, foreign influence, female power, and political decay. But the fact that some stories were exaggerated does not mean the scandal was imaginary. Rasputin's conduct gave his enemies openings. His closeness to the imperial family made those openings enormous. Alexandra's defense of him made them explosive, and Nicholas's inability, or unwillingness, to remove him gave the impression of paralysis at the top. The monarchy's defenders faced an impossible task. To explain Rasputin honestly, they would have had to explain Alexei's illness. To explain Alexei's illness, they would have had to reveal the dynasty's most guarded vulnerability. So they fought rumor with denial, private reassurance, and occasional half-measures. It was not enough. Rumor thrives where official truth is incomplete. This is one of the coldest lessons in the Rasputin affair. Secrecy may protect a family for a time, but it can also destroy a government's ability to speak convincingly. The Romanovs had a reason for silence, a very human reason. But the public did not know that. What people saw was a disgraced holy man protected by an empress many already distrusted and tolerated by a Tsar many increasingly doubted. The scandal at the gates was not just that Rasputin behaved badly. It was that the gates did not close. And once people believed the palace could no longer keep corruption out, every locked door began to look suspicious. Chapter 10. The court turns against him. The hatred of Rasputin did not belong to one group. It spread through the court in layers. Nobles disliked him because he made a mockery of rank. Clergymen distrusted him because his holiness seemed disorderly, suspicious, and too convenient. Ministers feared him because even the rumor of his influence could weaken their authority. Members of the Romanov family themselves grew alarmed because they saw, perhaps more clearly than Nicholas and Alexandra did, how badly his presence damaged the monarchy's public dignity. What united these people was not always virtue. Some were genuinely concerned for Russia. Some were protecting their own position. Some were offended by Rasputin's behavior. Some were offended by his birth. Some saw him as a moral danger. Some saw him as a political opportunity. Court opposition to Rasputin was never pure, and that is what makes it interesting. It was a mixture of patriotism, snobbery, fear, jealousy, disgust, and survival instinct. But even mixed motives can point toward a real problem. By this stage, Rasputin had become more than a man with access. He had become a sign that normal barriers had failed. In a monarchy obsessed with order, he represented disorder. In a court built on ritual distance, he represented uncomfortable closeness. In a society where aristocrats treated birth as destiny, he represented a peasant hand reaching into the sanctified space of empire. The court could forgive many things if they came wrapped in the proper manners. Rasputin came wrapped in none of them. That was part of the humiliation. He did not merely influence, he embarrassed. His name made serious people lower their voices. His stories traveled through salons and government offices like a bad smell no one could quite remove. Every new rumor forced loyal monarchists into a defensive posture. They had to explain why the imperial family still tolerated him. They had to insist things were not as bad as they sounded. They had to pretend, sometimes, that a private scandal had not become a public wound. This is where Rasputin's symbolic power exceeded his actual power. He did not need to control policy to humiliate the court. He only needed to be believed capable of influencing it. A minister appointed for ordinary reasons could be dismissed as Rasputin's choice. A government change could be interpreted as the result of palace intrigue. A whisper from the Empress could be imagined as a command from the Siberian Pilgrim behind her. Once suspicion becomes the dominant language, even innocent events start speaking it. The Romanov relatives understood the danger with growing urgency. They were not revolutionaries. They were not enemies of monarchy. Many of them wanted to save the dynasty from itself. That made their alarm especially significant. When those closest to the old order began to see Rasputin as a threat, it revealed that the crisis had moved beyond gossip. The monarchy's own defenders were losing patience. Still, their criticism often failed because it ran into the private wall around Nicholas and Alexandra. To Alexandra, attacks on Rasputin were not neutral warnings. They came from people she already distrusted: courtiers, grandees, churchmen, relatives, society women, political figures. In her eyes, many of these people had never understood her suffering, never respected her faith, and never cared for Alexei as she did. Their outrage could therefore be dismissed as malice, pride, or spiritual blindness. There is a grim irony here. The more the court attacked Rasputin, the more Alexandra clung to him as proof of her own embattled righteousness. Opposition did not loosen the bond. It often tightened it. Nicholas stood in the middle, but not effectively enough. He was not unaware of the scandal. He knew Rasputin disturbed people. He knew the accusations existed. He knew the association damaged the image of the throne. Yet he also knew Alexandra's conviction, and he knew the role Rasputin seemed to play in her hope for Alexei. For Nicholas, removing Rasputin was not just a political decision. It threatened domestic peace and spiritual reassurance inside the family. A stronger ruler might have made the cruel choice anyway. Nicholas hesitated, and hesitation, in a crisis of legitimacy, can look like surrender. The court's hostility also exposed something deeper about the Romanov system. There was no healthy mechanism for resolving this conflict. In a constitutional monarchy, scandal might be investigated, influence limited, advisors replaced, public accountability imposed. In Nicholas's autocracy, everything depended on the ruler's will, the ruler's judgment, and the ruler's private household. If the ruler would not act, or could not act, frustration had nowhere legitimate to go. So it moved into conspiracy. Before it became a plot of murder, it became a habit of thought. Men and women began to speak as if the monarchy could be saved only by breaking through the palace's private defenses. They imagined intervention. They imagined pressure. They imagined removing the source of contamination. The language around Rasputin grew harsher because the normal language of warning had failed. This is the path by which loyalism becomes rebellion. Not rebellion against the dynasty, at least not at first. Rebellion in the name of the dynasty. That distinction matters. Many of Rasputin's elite enemies believed they were defending monarchy against a man who had captured it. They did not yet understand that the need for such a defense already proved how much authority had leaked away. The old order was beginning to turn on itself. A court that once existed to magnify the throne now whispered against the throne's private judgment. Nobles who depended on imperial favor complained that the imperial family had lost discernment. Clergy who blessed the sacred monarchy recoiled from the holy man protected near its heart. Relatives of the Tsar spoke with the alarm of people watching a family heirloom catch fire, while its owners insisted the smoke was harmless. Rasputin did not create all these fractures. He revealed them. And because he revealed them so vividly, because he was crude where the monarchy wanted polish, emotional where it wanted dignity, secretive where it needed trust, he became unbearable. Not only because of what he may have done, but because of what his presence said about everyone else. The court turned against him because it feared he was destroying the monarchy. But beneath that fear was another, more disturbing possibility. Perhaps the monarchy that could not free itself from Rasputin was already destroying itself. Chapter 11. the war that broke the dynasty. War did not create the Romanovs' weakness. It exposed it at a scale no palace wall could contain. When Russia entered World War I, the empire was already strained by poverty, political distrust, social unrest, and a monarchy that struggled to understand the speed of the modern world. But war has a way of taking every hidden crack in a state and forcing weight onto it. What had once been manageable, or at least postponable, became immediate. What had once been private incompetence became public suffering. What had once been rumor became hunger, casualty lists, and trains that did not arrive. At first, war could still be dressed in patriotic language, flags, prayers, ceremonies, speeches about duty and sacrifice. These things matter in the early days of conflict. They create a sense that suffering will be shared and meaningful. For an autocratic monarchy, war also offered a dangerous temptation: the hope that national unity might restore what politics had weakened. But unity built on emotion is fragile when the dead begin to multiply. Russia's armies faced enormous pressures. Defeats, shortages, poor supply, and staggering casualties damaged confidence not only in military leadership, but in the state itself. Soldiers at the front needed weapons, boots, food, ammunition, competent command, and the belief that their suffering served a government capable of leading them. Families at home needed bread, stability, and some assurance that sacrifice was not being wasted by distant men in decorated rooms. Increasingly, that assurance failed. The war reached into every household. It took sons, fathers, horses, grain, labor, and patience. It disrupted transport. It worsened shortages. It made inflation and hunger harder to ignore. Cities became tense with queues and anger. Villages felt the absence of men and animals drawn into the military machine. Every failure of supply became more than an inconvenience. It became a moral accusation against the regime. A government can ask people to endure a great deal if it appears competent. The Romanov government increasingly did not. This is where the war transformed Rasputin's story. Before 1914, he was a scandal attached to the private world of the imperial family. During the war, scandal became inseparable from national survival. The question was no longer merely, "Why is this strange man near the palace?" It became, "Is this strange man influencing a government while the country bleeds?" That shift was devastating. Under wartime pressure, people become less tolerant of ambiguity. They want clear enemies, clear explanations, clear sources of betrayal. Rasputin, already surrounded by suspicion, became a ready-made figure for national fear. If ministers changed, he was blamed. If policy failed, his name appeared in the whispers. If Alexandra pushed for certain decisions, people imagined Rasputin behind her. Whether the details were accurate mattered less and less. The war had made the public imagination feverish. And war did something else. It made the imperial family's isolation look unforgivable. In peacetime, a distant monarchy might survive through habit, ritual, and repression. In war, distance becomes insult. The people suffering outside the palace needed to feel that the rulers understood their pain. Instead, many saw Nicholas and Alexandra as enclosed in a private world of religious dependence, suspicion, and bad counsel. The contrast between frontline sacrifice and palace intrigue became politically poisonous. Nicholas's own sense of duty now pulled him toward a decision that would prove disastrous. He believed, as Tsar, that he had a sacred responsibility to stand with the army. This was not empty theater. For Nicholas, the army was tied to monarchy, nation, and divine obligation. Going closer to the front could appear noble, even necessary, through his own eyes. But symbolism can become a trap when it places a weak ruler in direct ownership of failure. Once Nicholas associated himself personally with military command, defeats and hardships could no longer be blamed as easily on generals alone. The Tsar became tied to the performance of the war. His sacred image, already worn thin, was now exposed to the daily grinding of military catastrophe. A monarch who presents himself as father and commander must answer, somehow, for the sons who do not return. Meanwhile, the government behind him grew more unstable. The war required coordination, practical competence, trust between civil and military authorities, and a willingness to use talented people even when they were politically inconvenient. Autocracy was poorly suited to this kind of flexible cooperation, especially under a ruler suspicious of forces that might limit his authority. Russia had capable individuals, but the system did not reliably turn capability into coherent action. This is one of the key points in the fall of the Romanovs. The dynasty was not destroyed by weakness alone, but by weakness under pressure. Many regimes are flawed. Fewer are forced to prove themselves every day in a war of mass armies, industrial supply, public morale, and national endurance. The Romanov state was asked to perform as a modern war machine, while still clinging to older habits of personal rule, court influence, bureaucratic rivalry, and sacred autocracy. It could not keep up. For ordinary Russians, the distinction between structural failure and personal blame did not matter much. People do not stand in bread lines thinking like political scientists. They feel cold, anger, fear, and humiliation. They hear that the army lacks supplies. They hear that ministers are incompetent. They hear that the Empress trusts Rasputin. They hear that powerful people are whispering of treason. The fragments do not need to form a perfectly accurate picture to become politically real. And so the war did what no single scandal could do. It connected the palace's private weakness to the nation's public suffering. Alexei's illness had opened the door to Rasputin. Alexandra's dependence had kept him near. Nicholas's sacred view of duty had made compromise difficult. The court's hostility had turned scandal into elite panic, but the war gave all of it a wider stage. It made every rumor matter more, every shortage feel like betrayal, every private decision seem like a possible wound to the country. Rasputin did not command the armies. He did not create the shortages. He did not invent autocracy's failures. But by the time war had begun breaking Russia, his presence near the imperial family offered a darkly convenient explanation for a disaster too large to comprehend. People could not easily grasp every failure of supply, administration, political culture, and military command. They could grasp the image of a disreputable holy man near the throne. That image traveled faster than nuance, and in the end, war stripped the Romanovs of the one thing they needed most, the benefit of the doubt. Without it, even their sincere gestures looked foolish. Even their private suffering looked selfish. And even their silence looked like guilt. The empire had trembled before. Now it was being shaken apart. Chapter 12. Alexandra, Rasputin, and the Empty Throne. When Nicholas II left Petrograd to take personal command of the army, he did not simply move closer to the front. He left a space behind him. In theory, the empire still had a ruler. Orders could travel. Ministers could report. The machinery of government still functioned, or at least continued moving. But politics is not only machinery. It is presence, confidence, timing, and the ability to make people believe that someone responsible is awake at the center of events. Nicholas's departure made the capital feel strangely exposed. Into that exposed space stepped Alexandra, not formally as sovereign, not as a crowned ruler in her own right, but as the person closest to Nicholas, the guardian of his trust, the mother of the heir, and the imperial voice still physically present near the nervous heart of government. Her influence grew at exactly the moment when the country most needed steadiness, broad confidence, and political skill. Alexandra had devotion. She did not have those other things. This is not a small distinction. She was not indifferent to Russia's fate. She believed she was serving Nicholas, defending autocracy, protecting the dynasty, and resisting disloyal men who would weaken the throne. But conviction can become dangerous when it is joined to isolation. Alexandra looked at the political world around her and saw betrayal almost everywhere. Ministers who disagreed could seem unreliable. Critics could seem treacherous. Calls for reform could look like attacks on sacred authority. And Rasputin, from her point of view, helped her see through the fog. That was precisely the problem. Rasputin's advice during these years has often been exaggerated into a fantasy of total control, as if he sat in darkness selecting ministers like pieces on a chessboard. The reality was messier and, in some ways, more damaging. He did not need full control to deepen the crisis. He needed only enough access, enough confidence from Alexandra, and enough rumor around his name to make every government change look contaminated. Ministerial instability became one of the clearest signs of decay. Men rose and fell too quickly. Appointments seemed erratic. Competence appeared less important than loyalty, suspicion, or invisible recommendation. Some decisions had explanations beyond Rasputin, of course. Wartime government was difficult. Nicholas had his own preferences. Factions competed. The bureaucracy was not a clean instrument waiting to be played by one hand, but the perception was ruinous. People believed the regime was being guided by private influence at the worst possible time. They believed Alexandra listened to Rasputin. They believed Nicholas listened to Alexandra. Therefore, in the political imagination, Rasputin sat alarmingly close to the chain of command. Whether that map of influence was exact mattered less than the fact that so many people accepted it as plausible. A monarchy can survive many criticisms. It cannot easily survive becoming ridiculous. And by this point, the Romanov government was not only feared or disliked, it was being mocked. The sacred aura around autocracy was thinning into something almost grotesque. Serious men spoke of dark forces. Courtiers whispered, politicians fumed, public trust collapsed into theatrical suspicion. The throne no longer looked like a pillar of order. It looked like a room where unseen hands moved the furniture at night. Alexandra's letters to Nicholas from this period reveal the emotional pattern, even without turning every line into a conspiracy. She urged him. She warned him. She defended Rasputin. She framed political disagreements in personal and spiritual terms. Her language was intimate, loyal, anxious, and sometimes severe. That intimacy is important because it shows how the public crisis entered the private marriage. Statecraft became entangled with love, fear, and religious certainty. For Nicholas, far from the capital and burdened by military responsibility, Alexandra's confidence may have seemed like steadiness. She was devoted to him when others criticized him. She defended his authority when politicians demanded concessions. She insisted that firmness was strength. In a world where he often felt besieged, her voice could feel like the voice that still believed. But devotion is not the same as judgment. Alexandra's distrust narrowed the regime's field of vision. Rasputin's presence intensified that narrowing. Together, they helped create an atmosphere in which criticism was treated less as information than as infection. Men who might have helped stabilize the government were dismissed or distrusted. Voices calling for practical reform could be interpreted as enemies of the throne. The more the state needed collaboration, the more the palace retreated into loyalty tests. This is one of the cruel patterns of failing power. As legitimacy weakens, rulers often seek certainty in smaller circles. Those smaller circles then make legitimacy weaker. The Romanovs needed wider trust. They relied instead on private trust. They needed credible institutions. They leaned on personal devotion. They needed transparency. They produced silence. They needed political imagination. They reached for spiritual reassurance. Rasputin stood at the center of that contradiction. He was not the prime minister. He was not a general. He was not the author of Russia's wartime collapse. But he was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong hour, protected by the wrong kind of loyalty. His advice, whether occasional or significant, became politically unbearable because it seemed to bypass every formal structure of responsibility. There was also the matter of gender, and we should not ignore it. Alexandra was judged harshly not only because she was isolated and foreign-born, but because many men at court and in politics feared the idea of a woman influencing the Tsar. Some accusations against her were sharpened by misogyny, xenophobia, and wartime hysteria. Yet recognizing that prejudice does not erase the real damage of her political role. She was unfairly hated in some ways, and genuinely harmful in others. Both can be true. That complexity is easy to lose because the Rasputin story invites caricature. The hysterical empress, the hypnotic monk, the weak Tsar, the rotten court. There is some truth buried under those images, but they are too crude to explain the disaster. The more unsettling reality is that no one needed to be a cartoon villain. Alexandra could be sincere and dangerous. Nicholas could be dutiful and ineffective. Rasputin could be less powerful than rumor claimed, and still catastrophic to the monarchy's credibility. The system could be collapsing from within even as each person insisted they were trying to save it. In Petrograd, the empty throne was not literally empty, but it felt unattended. The Tsar was away with the army. The Empress was distrusted in the capital. Rasputin's name clung to government decisions like smoke to fabric. Ministers changed. Rumors multiplied. The war worsened. And every attempt by the palace to defend itself seemed to confirm that it no longer understood how it looked from outside. That blindness may have been the fatal weakness. Not Rasputin alone, not Alexandra alone, not Nicholas's absence alone, but the inability to grasp that monarchy depends not only on what rulers believe about themselves, but on what the country can still believe about them. By leaving Petrograd, Nicholas hoped to embody responsibility. Instead, he made the government seem more mysterious, more private, and more vulnerable to the very forces people feared were already guiding it. The throne still existed, but in the imagination of Russia, it was beginning to look occupied by shadows. Chapter 13. Rumors of treason. In wartime, rumor does not behave like ordinary gossip. It becomes a weapon, a diagnosis, and sometimes a kind of emotional shelter. When people cannot understand why their country is failing, rumor offers shape. It gives suffering a plot. It tells the hungry that someone is hiding the bread, tells the grieving that someone wasted the soldiers, tells the frightened that defeat must have a secret author. By the later years of the war, Russia was full of that need. The army had suffered terribly. The home front was strained by shortages and disorder. The government appeared unstable. Ministers came and went. Nicholas was away at military headquarters. Alexandra remained in Petrograd, isolated and widely distrusted. Rasputin's name, already darkened by scandal, now floated through every conversation about invisible influence. And Alexandra had one additional burden that made suspicion easier to ignite. She had been born German. In peacetime, that fact had already made her vulnerable at court. In wartime, with Russia fighting Germany and its allies, it became politically poisonous. To many Russians, Alexandra's origins were no longer a biographical detail. They became evidence in a story people were ready to believe: that the Empress was secretly sympathetic to the enemy, that the palace was compromised, that Russia's suffering might not be only incompetence, but betrayal. This is where fear becomes cruel. There is no need to prove Alexandra was guilty for the rumor to matter. In fact, her loyalty to Nicholas and to the dynasty was fierce. She did not think of herself as an enemy of Russia. She believed she was defending the throne, the family, and the sacred order she had embraced. But public trust had fallen so low that her own sense of loyalty no longer carried persuasive force. People judged her not by what she believed about herself, but by what her isolation allowed them to imagine. Rasputin made that imagination darker. If Alexandra alone had been mistrusted, the rumor might have remained focused on foreignness. If Rasputin alone had been hated, the scandal might have remained moral and political. Together, they formed something more dangerous, a conspiracy-shaped image: a foreign-born empress, a disreputable holy man, a distant Tsar, a suffering army, and a government that could not explain itself convincingly. It was almost too easy for rumor to assemble the pieces, and rumor is rarely fair to complexity. The public did not see Alexandra as a mother terrified for Alexei, clinging to a man she believed had helped her son survive. They did not see private letters full of anxiety, devotion, and rigid conviction. They did not see the emotional history that made Rasputin indispensable to her. What they saw, or thought they saw, was an empress protecting a scandalous figure while the state staggered through war. That was enough. Whispers of treason began to do what treason itself would have done. They corroded legitimacy. They suggested that the highest household in Russia could not be trusted with Russia's fate. Once that suggestion entered the bloodstream of public opinion, every mistake by the regime became suspicious. A failed supply line was not only a failure. A bad appointment was not only a bad appointment. A military setback was not only a military setback. Each could be folded into the same poisonous story. Someone is betraying us. This is one of the most dangerous sentences a nation can start to believe. It releases anger from the burden of patience. It turns incompetence into crime. It turns political frustration into moral panic. And because betrayal is often hidden by nature, lack of evidence can be twisted into proof of how deep the conspiracy runs. Official denials become part of the cover. Silence becomes confession. Complexity becomes evasion. The Romanovs were especially vulnerable because they had relied on secrecy for so long. The hidden illness of Alexei had taught the imperial family to guard the truth even when misunderstanding grew outside the doors. That habit may have protected the child, but it weakened the state's credibility. By the time wartime rumors surged, the palace had little reserve of trust left. It could deny betrayal, but denial from an already mistrusted institution carries little weight. Alexandra's own behavior did not help. Her tone toward critics was often severe. Her confidence in Rasputin seemed impossible to explain. Her suspicion of ministers and politicians encouraged the impression that she lived in a private political universe. She believed firmness would save the throne. To many others, her firmness looked like fanaticism. She believed loyalty to Nicholas was loyalty to Russia. Others increasingly saw loyalty to Nicholas's autocracy as hostility to Russia's survival. The tragic part is that the most extreme rumors were not necessary for the monarchy to be damaged. Even without proving treason, people could see failure. They could see instability. They could see that the Empress was unpopular, that Rasputin remained protected, that the Tsar seemed distant, and that the government did not inspire confidence. The rumor of treason gave those observations a sharper edge, but it did not create them from nothing. It fed on real dysfunction. That is why conspiracy theories become powerful in collapsing systems. They do not have to be entirely invented. They attach themselves to visible facts, then supply a hidden intention behind them. A bad government becomes a captured government. A foolish decision becomes a malicious one. A disliked advisor becomes an agent of darkness. It is a terrible form of storytelling, but it is storytelling, and people under pressure often reach for stories that explain pain. Rasputin, of course, was perfect material for such a story. He was strange enough to seem capable of secret influence, scandalous enough to seem corrupt, religious enough to seem manipulative, close enough to the Empress to seem dangerous, poorly understood enough to become almost anything his enemies needed him to be. Whether he actually served hidden interests was less important than the way his presence made hidden interests feel plausible. This was the final transformation of Rasputin in the public mind. He was no longer merely a holy man of doubtful reputation. He was no longer merely a scandal at court. He had become part of the imagined explanation for national catastrophe. And once a person becomes that, evidence struggles to catch up. Facts move slowly. Rumor moves at the speed of fear. Inside the palace, Alexandra may still have believed she was fighting for Nicholas, Alexei, and Holy Russia. Outside, many increasingly believed the palace itself was the danger. The two realities had separated so completely that no speech, no ceremony, no reassurance could easily bring them together again. The Romanovs were not only losing a war, they were losing the right to be believed. And when a dynasty reaches that point, even loyalty begins to sound to frightened ears like treason. Chapter 14. The Plot to Save the Monarchy. By the time the idea of killing Rasputin began to harden into action, it did not feel to his enemies like ordinary murder. That is one of the most disturbing parts of the story. The men who moved against him were not revolutionaries trying to destroy the Romanov dynasty. They were not outsiders storming the palace gates. They came from within the world of privilege, rank, and imperial loyalty. Some were aristocrats. Some were connected to the highest circles of society. They believed, or convinced themselves, that Rasputin had become a poison in the body of the monarchy, and that removing him might save what remained. This was a desperate kind of patriotism. It was also an admission of failure. If the only way to save a sacred autocracy is for members of its own elite to secretly kill a man protected by the imperial family, then the sacred autocracy is already in grave trouble. The plot against Rasputin was not a sign of health. It was a symptom. It showed that normal channels of influence had broken down so completely that conspiracy began to look, to some loyalists, like duty. Their motives were not simple. They rarely are. There was genuine fear for Russia. The war was going badly. Public trust was collapsing, and the monarchy seemed trapped in a private fog of bad judgment. There was also class resentment. Rasputin's closeness to the throne insulted men who believed access to power should pass through birth, office, service, and tradition. There was moral disgust, fueled by stories of drunkenness and sexual scandal. There was political panic, sharpened by rumors that Alexandra and Rasputin were guiding the state toward ruin. And there was personal vanity, too, the old aristocratic belief that history might be rescued by dramatic men performing dramatic deeds. That last part should not be ignored. Conspirators often imagine themselves more clearly than they understand the world they are trying to change. In their minds, the problem becomes beautifully narrow. One man stands between the nation and recovery. Remove him, and the spell breaks. The Tsar sees clearly. The Empress is freed from influence. The court regains dignity. The public regains trust. The dynasty survives. It is a seductive idea because it is simpler than reality. Rasputin by then had become the perfect target for simplification. He was visible, hated, scandalous, and symbolically overloaded. Killing him could feel like cutting out the visible tumor while ignoring the disease beneath it. Autocracy's rigidity, wartime breakdown, hunger, distrust, political incompetence, and the fatal secrecy surrounding the heir. But in the winter atmosphere of the capital, nuance had little appeal. The conspirators believed time was running out. To them, Rasputin was not just embarrassing the monarchy, he was preventing its rescue. Every day he remained alive seemed to deepen the humiliation. Every rumor attached to his name seemed to weaken the army, the government, and the throne. His survival itself became intolerable, as if the empire's entire weakness had condensed into one living body. That is the logic of scapegoating. But it was not only scapegoating. Rasputin had truly become damaging. His presence near Alexandra was politically corrosive. His reputation made the imperial family look compromised. His name poisoned appointments and decisions whether or not he caused them. A symbol can become so destructive that removing it seems rational. The mistake was believing the symbol was the source. The plotters were not wrong that Rasputin harmed the monarchy. They were wrong to think the monarchy could be saved by his death. This is where the story becomes almost surgical in its tragedy. The aristocrats who wanted him gone could diagnose the scandal, but not the system. They saw the peasant mystic at the gates of power, but not the deeper conditions that had brought him there. They saw Alexandra's dependence, but not fully the terror of Alexei's illness. They saw Nicholas's weakness, but still hoped that one violent act could restore the authority he had failed to exercise. They saw the smoke and believed that if they smothered it, the fire might go out. Instead, their plot revealed how far the fire had spread. Because political murder is not merely an event, it changes the moral weather around it. Once elites begin to justify killing in the name of saving the state, they teach everyone watching that the state can no longer save itself by lawful means. The assassins may have imagined themselves as loyal servants of monarchy, but their method belonged to a country already sliding toward revolutionary logic. When authority fails, force will speak. Rasputin's enemies had spent years saying he polluted the throne. Now they were preparing to stain themselves in order to cleanse it. The irony is sharp, but not surprising. People who believe they are defending a sacred order often permit themselves unsacred methods when fear becomes strong enough. They tell themselves the act is exceptional, necessary, temporary, a final violence to prevent greater violence. History is not kind to that argument. It tends to multiply rather than end the darkness. Still, we should not flatten the conspirators into villains either. They lived inside a collapsing world. The war was real. The anger was real. The fear that Russia might be lost was real. They could see the monarchy becoming a national joke and a national danger at the same time. They had warned. Others had warned. The imperial family had not listened. In that atmosphere, murder began to look not like madness, but like the last available lever. That may be the most frightening thing about the plot. Not that men hated Rasputin enough to kill him, but that they could imagine no better way to save their country. So the plan took shape in secrecy among people who believed they were acting before it was too late. A palace would become a trap. Hospitality would become theater. Conversation would become bait. And the man who had entered imperial history through prayer, illness, and rumor would be drawn toward the final scene of his legend. The conspirators thought they were about to remove a curse from the Romanovs. They were about to discover that the curse, if there was one, had never lived in Rasputin alone. Chapter 15. Murder in the Yusupov Palace. Rasputin's death has always been difficult to tell soberly, because the legend keeps trying to take over the room. The famous version is almost too theatrical. A winter night, a noble palace, poisoned cakes and wine, a hidden group of conspirators, a prince playing host to a doomed holy man, and Rasputin somehow refusing to die until bullets, panic, and cold water complete what poison could not. It reads like a Gothic novel pretending to be a police report. And that is the first warning. When a historical event sounds perfectly designed for myth, we have to slow down. What can be said with confidence is that Rasputin was lured to the Yusupov Palace in Petrograd in December 1916. The conspirators included Prince Felix Yusupov, a wealthy aristocrat married into the Romanov family, and others who believed Rasputin's removal was necessary to rescue the monarchy. The setting itself was symbolic. Not a dark alley, not a revolutionary cellar, but a palace belonging to the highest ranks of Russian society. Rasputin was not killed by peasants, workers, or radicals. He was killed by men from the very world the monarchy was supposed to command. That detail matters more than the poison, because the murder was, in effect, an aristocratic confession. It admitted that the elite no longer trusted the imperial family to protect the throne from its own private attachments. They believed they had to do what Nicholas would not do. In their minds, they were not attacking monarchy. They were performing emergency surgery on it. The famous story of the assassination comes largely through accounts shaped after the fact, especially by people with reasons to dramatize their own role. According to later versions, Rasputin was offered poisoned food and drink, yet did not collapse as expected. Yusupov, frightened and amazed, then shot him. Rasputin supposedly revived, struggled, fled into the courtyard, and was shot again. His body was later disposed of in the icy river. It is a gripping story. It is also disputed. The poison may not have worked for ordinary reasons. It may not have been administered as described. Some details may have been embellished to make Rasputin appear nearly supernatural, or to make the conspirators seem as if they had faced not a man, but a force. The more Rasputin refused to die in the telling, the more meaningful the murder became. A simple killing would have been brutal. A killing of a man who seemed impossible to kill became legend. That legend served several purposes. For Rasputin's enemies, it proved he had been unnatural, corrupt, almost demonic, someone whose death required extraordinary violence. For those fascinated by him, it enlarged his mystery. For the conspirators, it transformed a shabby act of deception and murder into an epic scene of national rescue. No one wants to remember themselves as frightened men bungling an assassination in a basement. It is far more flattering to imagine oneself battling a monster. But beneath the theatrical fog, the human scene was probably uglier and smaller. A man was invited under false pretenses. He trusted enough to come. His hosts had already decided he would not leave alive. Whatever one thinks of Rasputin, healer, fraud, manipulator, believer, scandal, his death was not clean justice delivered by history. It was murder carried out by men who had convinced themselves that the law could be bypassed because the stakes were too high. That is a dangerous conviction. And yet, the panic in that palace was real. The conspirators had placed themselves beyond ordinary politics. Once the plan began, they could not easily return to the world of warnings and whispered complaints. If the poison failed, if Rasputin resisted, if the noise drew attention, if he escaped, they faced disaster. The myth of the unkillable Rasputin may have grown from this atmosphere. Confusion, fear, adrenaline, poor planning, and later self-justification. The Yusupov Palace became a stage where everyone arrived already trapped by the role they had chosen. Rasputin arrived as the man too close to the throne. Yusupov arrived as the aristocrat who believed he could save Russia through violence. The other conspirators arrived as witnesses to a crime they hoped would become a patriotic act. And outside, beyond the palace walls, the empire did not pause. Soldiers were still dying. Food shortages still pressed on cities. Trust in the government still collapsed by the day. The murder felt enormous because Rasputin had become enormous in the Russian imagination. But the problems waiting outside the palace were larger than any one body could contain. That is what makes the assassination so darkly revealing. The conspirators believed they were killing the cause of the monarchy's humiliation. In reality, they were killing its most visible symptom. Rasputin had become intolerable because he made the dynasty's weakness visible. The secrecy, the dependence, the isolation, the inability of Nicholas to act decisively, the distrust of Alexandra, the collapse of confidence among elites. His death could remove the symbol, but not the conditions that had made the symbol powerful. The body could be hidden. The meaning could not. Once news of Rasputin's murder spread, it did not restore dignity to the throne. It exposed how desperate the ruling class had become. Imagine what the public could now see. Nobles murdering a man close to the imperial family because they believed the government was under corrupt influence. This was not reassurance. This was confirmation that the highest circles of Russia were tearing themselves apart. Even the punishment that followed seemed to underline the weakness. The killers were not treated like ordinary criminals in the eyes of many observers. Rank still mattered. Connections still mattered. The entire affair carried the scent of a system that could not apply its own rules evenly, even when faced with a political murder at its center. Rasputin's death did not quiet the rumors. It completed them. The man who had lived as a scandal now died as a myth. Every disputed detail became useful: the poison that failed, the bullets, the flight, the river, the autopsy debates. The stories told and retold until the assassination felt less like an event than an omen. Even in death, Rasputin remained what he had been in life: a figure onto whom Russia projected fear, disgust, fascination, and the suspicion that something sacred had gone terribly wrong. The conspirators wanted an ending. What they created was a final, unforgettable image of decay. A palace basement, a noble plot, a murdered holy man, a dynasty so weakened that its defenders had begun to behave like enemies of its own law. And when Rasputin finally disappeared into death, the Romanovs were not freed from the shadow around them. They were left alone with it. Chapter 16, The Death That Solved Nothing. For a brief moment, Rasputin's enemies may have believed the air had cleared. The man was dead. The scandal had been cut away. The Empress's most hated confidant could no longer receive visitors, offer advice, send recommendations, or stand as the living proof of the monarchy's humiliation. Those who had plotted against him could tell themselves that they had acted in time, that Russia might now wake from a fever, that Nicholas might finally see what had been done to his throne. But history did not move in that direction. Rasputin's murder solved almost nothing because Rasputin had never been the whole problem. He had been a symbol of problems older, deeper, and more stubborn than one man's influence. His death removed the face from the scandal, but it did not restore food to the cities, competence to the government, trust to the monarchy, or victory to the army. It did not heal the divisions at court. It did not make Nicholas politically stronger. It did not make Alexandra beloved. It did not give the Romanov system the flexibility it had refused for years. The deeper crises remained exactly where they had been. War still pressed down on Russia with unbearable weight. Shortages still fed public anger. Soldiers still suffered. Workers still struck. Political reform still came too late, or not at all. The capital still hummed with distrust. The imperial family still seemed removed from the suffering of the country. Rasputin had been killed, but the conditions that made people believe in dark forces had not disappeared. In some ways, his murder made those conditions more visible. The assassination revealed that the ruling elite itself was fractured beyond repair. This was not an act carried out by enemies outside the system. It came from within the imperial world. Aristocrats had conspired because they believed the monarchy could not correct its own course. That fact was devastating. It told the country that even those closest to privilege had lost faith in the judgment of the throne. A stable regime disciplines its servants. A collapsing regime is disciplined by them. That reversal mattered. The murder suggested that lawful authority had become too weak to command obedience from its own defenders. The conspirators may have imagined themselves as loyal saviors, but their actions showed something darker. Loyalty had begun to detach from legality. Men could now claim to serve the monarchy by violating its order. Once that idea enters political life, it rarely stays contained. Nicholas's response could not repair the damage. Whatever punishment followed, it could not undo the spectacle of elite conspiracy. If he punished the killers harshly, he risked alienating people who believed they had acted to save him. If he showed leniency, He confirmed that rank and proximity still distorted justice. Either way, the throne looked diminished. The Tsar was no longer the unquestioned center of command. He was a man reacting to a crime committed by those who claimed to understand his interests better than he did. Alexandra, meanwhile, lost not only a confidant, but a source of spiritual reassurance. To her, Rasputin's death was not a public cleansing. It was an attack. She could see it as further proof that the forces around the throne were malicious, faithless, and dangerous. The murder, therefore, did not open her outward to criticism. It likely drove her deeper into the conviction that the dynasty was surrounded by enemies. This is another reason the assassination failed. It was meant to break Rasputin's hold. But death can intensify a belief as easily as it ends one. For his enemies, Rasputin became the corpse of corruption. For Alexandra, he could become a martyr-like figure, a man destroyed by hatred. For the public, he became a legend more powerful dead than alive. The details of his death, already disputed and dramatic, began to circulate with a life of their own. Poison, bullets, water, resistance, prophecy. The story thickened. His body was gone, but his myth had become nearly impossible to control. And myth was exactly what the Romanovs did not need. They needed clarity. They needed competence. They needed political trust. Instead, they inherited an even darker legend at the center of an already failing state. Rasputin's murder did not end the whispers of palace corruption. It seemed to confirm that the whispers had been serious enough for princes to kill over. The public did not look at the assassination and see restored order. Many saw panic wearing the mask of patriotism. That is why this moment is so important to read carefully. The assassination was not the beginning of the Romanovs' collapse, and it was not the final cause. It was a flare in the darkness, briefly illuminating the shape of the disaster. In that light, one could see a Tsar unable to command confidence, an empress isolated and hated, an elite divided against itself, a war devouring the state, and a political system with no peaceful way to correct its own mistakes. Rasputin's death exposed the monarchy's weakness more than it cured it. The plotters had mistaken removal for renewal. They believed the disappearance of one man would allow the old order to breathe again. But the old order was not suffocating because Rasputin alone stood in the room. It was suffocating because the room had no air. The monarchy had lost the ability to persuade, adapt, and trust beyond its shrinking circle. Killing Rasputin could not recreate those abilities. There is a cold lesson here about scapegoats. Sometimes a scapegoat is innocent of the larger crime, but guilty of enough smaller ones to seem like the answer. Rasputin was not blameless. He was damaging. He encouraged suspicion. He benefited from access he should never have had. He became entangled in a family's desperation and a state's dysfunction. But he was never strong enough to destroy the Romanovs by himself. That was precisely why his death solved nothing. The forces that brought him close to power were still alive. Secrecy, fear, autocracy, emotional isolation, elite contempt, public suffering, and war. They had used Rasputin as a vessel. When the vessel was shattered, the forces remained. So after the murder, Russia did not calm. It listened. It watched. It drew conclusions. And those conclusions were devastating. If even princes were willing to kill in secret, if even the Tsar's relatives and aristocratic circles believed the monarchy was compromised, If even the death of the most hated man in Russia could not change the direction of events, then perhaps the problem was no longer Rasputin. Perhaps the problem was the throne itself. Chapter 17, The Dynasty Falls. By the time the Romanov dynasty fell, Rasputin was already dead. That fact is worth holding in the mind for a moment, because it quietly dismantles the simplest version of the story. If Rasputin had truly been the one man holding Russia hostage, his murder should have changed the direction of events. It did not. The empire did not recover. The government did not regain trust. The monarchy did not breathe freely. The war did not become easier to bear. Instead, the final collapse came quickly, almost brutally quickly, as if the structure had been waiting for one last pressure to finish what years of weakness had prepared. The February Revolution was not born from one drawing room scandal. It grew from bread shortages, war exhaustion, strikes, public anger, military disillusionment, and the accumulated disbelief that Nicholas II's government could still govern. Petrograd became the center of a crisis that the monarchy could no longer interpret correctly, much less control. Crowds gathered. Workers protested. Soldiers whose obedience had once been one of the pillars of imperial authority began to waver. This was the moment when autocracy lost its final argument. A czar can survive criticism if the army remains loyal. He can survive elite gossip if ordinary people still fear the state. He can survive policy failure if the machinery of command still obeys. But when soldiers hesitate to fire, when commanders doubt, when ministers panic, when the streets fill with people who no longer believe the old rituals have power, monarchy becomes suddenly fragile. Not gradually fragile. Suddenly, Nicholas was away from the capital, tied to the military command he had taken upon himself. The decision that was meant to show sacred responsibility now left him distant from the political heart of the crisis. Messages moved, reports arrived, advice was given, but events were outrunning the habits of the regime. The state needed speed, imagination, and legitimacy. Nicholas had procedure, duty, and a fading belief that order could still be restored if people simply remembered their places. They did not. The abdication of Nicholas II ended more than one reign. It ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule, a dynasty that had wrapped itself in divine authority, imperial ceremony, military grandeur, and sacred continuity was brought down not by a single assassin, not by one mystic, not by one palace rumor, but by the loss of belief across multiple layers of society. Workers no longer believed the state cared whether they starved. Soldiers no longer believed obedience was worth endless sacrifice. Elites no longer believed Nicholas could save the monarchy. Politicians no longer believed autocracy could survive without reform. And within the imperial family itself, the private world that had once felt like refuge had become a prison of misjudgment. Rasputin's role in this collapse must be placed carefully. To say he caused the fall of the Romanovs is too convenient. It gives history a villain with a beard and strange eyes, and lets the system around him escape too easily. Rasputin did not create the war, did not design Russia's social inequalities, did not invent Nicholas's political rigidity, did not force the monarchy into secrecy, and did not make the autocracy incapable of adaptation. But to say Rasputin did not matter would also be false. He mattered because he revealed the weakness of the dynasty in a form people could understand. He made the imperial family look irrational, secretive, and vulnerable to private influence. He deepened distrust of Alexandra. He humiliated the court. He gave critics of the monarchy a symbol so vivid that it could travel through rumor faster than any policy analysis. In the final years, his name became shorthand for everything that seemed diseased at the top. That is a different kind of historical power. Not the power to command armies, not the power to write laws, the power to make legitimacy rot faster. Rasputin's presence near the Romanovs did not break a healthy monarchy. It helped convince more and more people that the monarchy was not healthy at all. His scandal turned private dysfunction into public theater. His survival made Nicholas look weak. His protection made Alexandra look dangerous. His murder made the elite look desperate. Even in death, he remained useful to the collapse because he had already become part of the language by which Russia explained its anger. Still, when Nicholas abdicated, the decisive forces were larger than Rasputin's shadow. The war had exhausted the state. The cities were hungry. The army was unreliable. The government lacked credibility. The Tsar had lost the confidence not only of radicals, but of many who might once have defended the throne. That last point is crucial. Revolutions succeed not only when enemies rise, but when defenders step back. By 1917, too many people who had once needed the Romanovs had decided the Romanovs could no longer protect Russia, or even themselves. The dynasty fell because its authority had become hollow. The crown still existed. The titles still existed. The sacred language still existed. But the belief that gave those things force had drained away. Nicholas could sign papers, issue orders, and appeal to duty, but the old obedience no longer answered as it once had. There is a strange quietness in that kind of ending. For years, the monarchy had seemed immovable, ancient, ordained. Then, under pressure, it became clear how much of its strength had depended on consent, habit, and imagination. Once those dissolved, the dynasty did not fall like a fortress battered stone by stone. It fell more like a stage set after the audience has stopped believing the scene. Rasputin was part of that loss of belief. He was not the architect of the collapse, but he was one of its most unforgettable signs. Through him, Russians saw a ruling family trapped by fear, guided by secrecy, and unable to distinguish private salvation from public ruin. Through the hatred of him, the court revealed its own panic. Through his murder, the elite revealed its own lawlessness. Through the failure of his death to save anything, Russia learned that the sickness was not confined to one man. And so the Romanovs vanished from power, not because history had been bewitched, because an empire at war, ruled by an inflexible autocracy, led by a sincere but inadequate Tsar, and haunted by private secrets, finally reached the point where no symbol, no prayer, no execution, and no dynasty could hold it together. The man in the shadows was gone. The palace remained. But the world that had made the palace meaningful was collapsing outside its doors. Chapter 18. The Monk, the Myth, and the Ruins of Empire. Rasputin survived history because he is easier to remember than the system that produced him. A strange man is simpler than a failing state. A scandal is easier to picture than supply collapse, political rigidity, class resentment, military exhaustion, and the slow erosion of public trust. That is why his legend keeps returning. The peasant mystic in the palace, the holy man with a ruined reputation, the shadow near the throne. But the real story is more unsettling than the legend. Rasputin did not destroy the Romanovs alone. No single man could have done that. The dynasty was weakened by forces that had been gathering long before he entered the imperial family's private world. Autocracy that resisted adaptation, an emperor unsuited to crisis, an empress isolated by grief and suspicion, an heir's illness hidden behind palace doors, and a war that turned every weakness into public catastrophe. Still, Rasputin mattered. He mattered because he revealed what the Romanovs could not admit. Their sacred monarchy was not serene. It was frightened. Their public confidence rested on private desperation. Their political authority depended on a family secret. Their isolation made them vulnerable to a man whose greatest gift may not have been holiness or manipulation, but the ability to become necessary to people in pain. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the myth. Rasputin may have been sincere at times. He may also have exploited his access. He may have offered comfort to a terrified mother, and he may have enjoyed the power that comfort gave him. The evidence does not allow us to turn him neatly into saint or demon. He was something more human and therefore more troubling. A flawed man moving through a flawed world, enlarged by fear, rumor, and need. His enemies also made him powerful. They turned him into the explanation for everything they hated about the monarchy. Nobles saw in him the humiliation of class order. Clergy saw religious disorder. Politicians saw hidden influence. Ordinary Russians saw proof that the throne had become corrupt, foreign, or bewitched. Some of these fears were exaggerated. Some were cruel. Some were rooted in real damage. Together, they made Rasputin larger than life, and perhaps larger than he ever was in life. By the time he died, the myth had already escaped him. The murder in the Yusupov Palace did not cleanse the monarchy. It only showed how desperate its defenders had become. And when the Romanov dynasty fell soon after, Rasputin's ghost remained useful. He became the perfect symbol of a collapsing world. Mysterious, immoral, magnetic, half-known, and impossible to separate from the ruins around him. But symbols can mislead. If we blame Rasputin too much, we forgive the dynasty too easily. We forget the hungry cities, the exhausted soldiers, the workers and peasants, who no longer believed the old order cared whether they lived or died. We forget Nicholas's inability to change, Alexandra's disastrous dependence, the court's poisonous gossip, the elite's panic, and the war that broke whatever trust remained. Rasputin was not the disease. He was the fever, and fever tells us something important. It reveals that the body is already in danger. In the end, the man from Siberia did not bring down a 300-year dynasty by magic, seduction, or secret command. He walked into a palace where fear had already taken root. He became close to a family that needed hope more than judgment. He became a scandal to a court that needed someone to blame. He became a myth to a country trying to explain its own collapse. That is why his story endures. Not because he was all-powerful, because he was there, unmistakably there, at the point where private anguish met public disaster.